In this video, we're going to talk about methods. And as I mentioned, you've actually already seen some methods in use. So let's go back to the project tab, open our first script. And now in here, start and update are both methods. So the easiest way to think of methods at this point is a group of code. So it's a way that you can start making your code separate and modular where you can use it over and over again. So to get started, let's actually just delete everything that we have in our code here. Okay, and our script's basically back to how it was when we started. So we have a start method here and an update method. So let's try creating our own method. Now, one thing I want to note here is the order that your methods are listed in this code does not actually matter. So start and update here are called by Unity. If we reverse these and we put update above start, it will not make a difference at all. So I'm just going to put mine at the end here. I'm going to press enter a few times, make some space. So when we create our method, we need to do it just like update and start, where we start it with the word void. And we're not going to talk about what that actually does yet. We're going to cover that later. So just don't worry about it for right now. Basically, void means nothing. And now for our method names, it's kind of like variable names, except we want to start the first word with an uppercase letter. Now this isn't required by any means. You can start your methods with a lowercase letter, but it is good practice and it's going to make your code a lot easier to read later. And you'll see why as we start expanding with our scripts. So to name this one, I'm just going to call it display name, and I'm just going to make it display my name. And now right after it, we need to put open and close brackets just like we have here with start and update. Okay, and then we need to put the curly brace brackets. So as soon as you type the first one, Visual Studio will add the second, but you need those there. And as I mentioned before, this is what tells Visual Studio all of the code in here belongs to display name. And just like the name of the method, I'm just going to put debug.log, and I'm just going to output my name. Now it's really good practice to make your method names really descriptive of what they're going to do. So in this case, I put display name. That's pretty obvious when we see it. If you don't do that, just like I mentioned with variable names, it gets very hard to troubleshoot and trace your code back later. Okay, so now we have three methods: start, update, and display name. So let's go back to Unity and let's run our game. Okay, and if we go to the console, notice nothing happened. And if I click on scripts, I do still have my script attached. So the script is there, but it's not doing anything. And this is because we're never calling this method. So we're basically never saying run display name. Start and update are two special ones that are built in for Unity, and Unity calls those automatically. So it'll call start when the object starts, and then it'll call update every frame. We have to do something similar on our own to display name. So what we can do is in start, if we want to call it right at the start, we can start typing display name, and notice it shows up in the autocomplete here. And then we just have to add the open and close bracket and a semicolon. So having these brackets here makes it very clear that display name is a method. And now this is going to run at the start of our game. So let's go test this one out. All right, and my name displayed. Now we can display that as many times as we want. So if I copy these lines, I put it in here 3 times, this is going to run that code 3 times at the start of our game. So now you see Mike 3 times. So what happens once our code is running? Unity is going to call start, and it's going to run through all the lines of code in here one at a time. Once it hits this line, it's going to call the method called display name, and it's going to run all the code in here first. Then it comes back and it's going to run the next code. So it all runs in order. And just to demonstrate that, this might make it look a bit more clear. What I'll do is in between each time we call the method, I'm just going to do a debug.log, and I'm going to say, I'll just say in between method calls. Or in between methods, we'll go with that. Okay, and I'm going to copy that. I'm going to put it here. So what we should see is it's going to reach display name. It's going to call this method and run this code. Then it comes back to start, goes to the next line. It'll output this. Then it'll run display name again. Then it'll output here. So I think this should make it logical when you see it of how this code runs. So let's try this out. Okay, and that's exactly what we expected. So our name in between methods, our name in between methods, and our name. Okay, and it's probably pretty clear already the benefit of a method where you can reuse your code. But just in case it's not, I'm going to show you here of why this is a benefit. So say if we made a method that we'll say, let's change this display stats. We'll put out our name. I'll do something like health. And I'll just put, say, 79. Normally this would be, we would add a variable to display, not just a number, but just for this case, I'm going to show it like this. So we'll display health. We'll say strength. We'll give it 9. So say you had 20 different stats that you were outputting here. We got to change this. So notice it changed to a red line because display name doesn't exist anymore. So we can change that to display stats. Okay, so now anytime I call this, it's going to display all these stats. If you weren't using a method for this and you were manually putting in everywhere you have to display the stats, you would have to type all the lines of code out each time, which that alone isn't that bad of a thing. But when you factor in what if all of a sudden you wanted to change that, say you wanted to just change the order or you wanted to add a new value, you would have to go to every spot in your code that you display that info and make that change to correct it. Whereas here, say if we were calling display stats 70 times in different spots through our game, which is an exaggeration, we shouldn't be doing it that much, but just say if we were, and then if we went here, we could just do debug.log and let's just put a new stat in here. So we'll say crit and we'll put, say, 2%. Now that's going to show up in every spot that we call display stats. We don't have to go through and find all those spots to make the change. So that's the major benefit of methods, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to it. Now the next thing I want to show you with using a method is inside these brackets when we create our method, we can put in here what are called parameters. And that may sound complicated, but all it's doing is it's going to tell the method that we want to take in some values when it's being called. And the way we do this is we just use variables. So the same variables that we created in the last lesson, we can put inside here. So say if I wanted to make a method, let's change this from display stats, and I'm going to put display sum. Or you know what? Let's get rid of that. Let's just put sum. And we're going to add two numbers together and display them. So what we can do here is inside we can put int a, which is going to create a variable called a of type integer. And then let's do int b. So now we're going to take in, anytime we call sum, we take in two numbers. And they're going to store inside these two variables. But the difference with this is when we created the variables up here above start, we could use those anywhere inside of our code. When we do this, these variables, a and b, can only be used inside of this sum method. So you'll notice if I type a here, you see it auto-completes and it's there. If I go to update and I type a, it doesn't exist because it's only available inside of sum. And that's a very important thing called scope that we're going to learn a lot about as we progress. But for right now, you just need to make sure you know inside a method, these variables only work in here. So now that we have those, we can do debug.log. Just like we did previously, we can do a plus b. So now it's going to take those numbers and add them together. And remember, these are numbers, not strings. So if we did something like this, this would not work because this is trying to add the letter A to the letter B. It's not going to actually take these variables. So we need to make sure we pass in the variables. Okay, and up here we have the red line because we changed the name, so we need to change this to sum. Okay, and now notice, we changed it to sum, but we're still getting a red line for an error, and it says there's no argument given that corresponds to the parameter a for the first number. So if we look here, notice it shows first script, sum, and then we see int a, int b. So it's showing us right here what we have to pass in anytime we call sum. So it's saying we have to give it an integer and another integer. So all we have to do is we could put in here, say 5. Notice we're still getting the red line because it hasn't met all those requirements yet. Then a comma and 2. So when you're doing this, you can add as many variables here as you want. You just have to separate each one with a comma. And if you wanted, you could only do one. You don't need a comma at all. So we could do it like this. But then we have the error because it expects B. Okay. So I'm just going to change that back. We'll do 5 and 2. Okay, to just quickly summarize here. So we made a sum method, and it takes in an integer of A and B. And then it's going to debug out A plus B. So let's go and try this in our code and make sure this works. We should get 7 in the console. All right, so there we are. That's working. So now you've learned how to create your own method and how to pass in values into it. So I would recommend playing around with that for a bit. Make sure you get that. And in the next video, I'm actually going to give you an assignment to kind of challenge you to create one on your own.